My nightmare of a stepmother decided to play "Let's burn all your late mom's belongings," which landed my dad in the hospital, so I unleashed my inner Hulk on her. My stepmother and I have never exactly been besties, but I'll never forget the night she drunkenly called me, practically giddy, to announce, "I burned all your mom's stuff. It was just a bunch of junk anyway. Honestly, you should be thanking me. Consider it a favor." The audacity was off the charts. I was so stunned I just hung up, left sitting there, trying to process what kind of universe I'd woken up in. But then the notifications started flooding in. She decided to document her little bonfire of memories with a full photo album of ashes, each picture paired with a string of laughing emojis. Yep, because nothing says family bonding like setting fire to someone's past and then laughing about it. Honestly, if there were an award for Most Unhinged Family Member of the Year, she'd have it in the bag. My dad and I were out on a peaceful camping trip when all this chaos broke loose. So, there I was, waking him up in the dead of night to deliver the world's worst news. At first, he thought I was joking, but when I showed him the proof, his face went from half asleep to ghostly white in seconds. He staggered out of the tent, clutching his chest, and that's when I knew this had gone from bad to I need to call a helicopter level. The airlift arrived in 15 minutes, and we were flown straight to the hospital, me holding his hand, phone buzzing like crazy the whole way. Of course, my stepmother was blowing up my notifications, demanding I answer her calls as if this was just some petty drama she was missing out on. When we got to the hospital, they rushed him into the ICU and hooked him up to every machine imaginable. I sat there, gripping his hand, watching his chest rise and fall, feeling the crushing guilt that I might have triggered this whole ordeal by telling him. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the message. It was the madness behind the message. And as I watched my phone light up with her 27th call, I realized my stepmother somehow thought this was the perfect time for a follow-up conversation. After what felt like an eternity, the doctors finally managed to stabilize him. They told me he was incredibly lucky to have pulled through, but warned that he was still in a fragile state. Any more stress could be dangerous, they said. Words that practically echoed in my head. So, for the next few days, I barely left his side. Every time I so much as stepped out to grab a coffee, I'd rush back in a panic, imagining the worst. The doctors kept reminding me, he needs rest, no stress, as if that was easy with my stepmother still floating around like a stress fairy godmother with a flaming torch. But keeping things calm? Not so simple. After all, my stepmother had practically set fire to my dad's peace of mind and my mom's memories in one fell swoop. And honestly, she'd always been bitter whenever anyone said something sweet about my mom. It's as if she thought compliments about my mom somehow subtracted from her own life points. Last Thanksgiving, the whole family was gathered around the dining table, and it was the first time my dad brought his new girlfriend, my soon-to-be stepmom, to a family holiday. Everyone was practically buzzing with curiosity, eager to meet the woman who had finally put a smile back on Dad's face after so many years. I remember sitting next to him, with her on his other side, holding his hand like it was a lifeline. She looked a little nervous, which made sense. She was meeting a crowd that could rival a reality TV cast reunion. My dad kept patting her hand and whispering reassurances, probably something like, "They're harmless, mostly." As we passed dishes around and started filling plates, the conversation drifted naturally to memories of my mom. It happened every year. It didn't matter how much time had passed, she was always part of our holidays. Aunt Linda leaned over and said to Dad's new girlfriend, "You're as lovely as Mary was." Mary was my mom. "My brother sure knows how to pick them," she added with a grin, which earned murmurs of agreement around the table. For a second, I saw my stepmom's smile falter, but she quickly put it back on and nodded politely, like she was watching a rerun of someone else's family show. As dinner went on, more stories about my mom kept flowing. How she made the best pecan pie, how she'd sneak an extra slice to my cousin Jake, and how she always had this way of making everyone feel special. My soon-to-be stepmom kept nodding and smiling, though by now it looked a little forced, like she was holding on to her smile for dear life. The real shift came when Uncle Joe, who always led the Thanksgiving prayer, asked us to bow our heads. We all lowered our heads, and he started his usual heartfelt blessing. Rest in peace, and know that she is missed dearly every day. As soon as Uncle Joe mentioned my mom's name, I felt my stepmom shift uncomfortably in her seat. The hand she was holding under the table suddenly squeezed mine tighter, like I'd been caught up in some uncomfortable hostage situation. I glanced over at her. Her eyes were closed for the prayer, but it was clear she was anything but peaceful. In that moment, I realized the truth. She was bitter. Bitter that no matter how hard she tried, she'd always be the one competing with my mom's memory. Not exactly the way to win points at a family Thanksgiving. The second Uncle Joe finished, she released my hand like it was on fire and immediately went for her wine glass, taking a long, "I need this to survive" sip as everyone murmured, "Amen." My dad, completely oblivious, just smiled at her and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, as if everything was just fine. But I saw it, a dark, simmering resentment that was as clear as day. Fast forward to a few months later, and there we were in the hospital. My dad was just waking up, looking more alert than he had in days, and the first thing he told me was that he needed to talk to Stephanie. I was torn. On one hand, I worried about what might happen if we stirred the pot. But my dad was insistent, and deep down, I knew he was right. Letting this fester any longer wasn't an option. So, we waited until he was discharged. Even though he was still weak, we decided to confront her at home. When we walked in, the tension was thick enough to slice with a butter knife. My stepmom was lounging on the couch, watching TV like she hadn't just turned our family into a live episode of true crime. The sight of her was enough to make my blood boil, but I kept it together for my dad's sake. He told her that they needed to talk. She tried to greet him with open arms, but he pushed her away, leaving her looking stunned and a little lost, like someone just stole her spotlight. She finally asked what was wrong, and that's when he laid it all out. No more pretending, no more sweeping things under the rug. "You know damn well what's wrong. You burned all of my wife's things," my dad said, voice shaking with anger. For a second, she actually looked caught off guard, her face turning red. But then, in classic stepmom style, she tried to turn it around, claiming that if my dad didn't still love my mom, why would it matter? She practically shouted, "They were just things cluttering up the house." My dad was absolutely fuming, and I had to signal for him to sit down. Practically ready to grab a defibrillator myself, but he snatched his arm away, determined to finish. "This was all she had of her mom, and you threw it away for space?" he yelled. She just rolled her eyes and said he was being too dramatic, like he'd misplaced his car keys, not lost every memento of my mom. "You can't live in the past forever, you know," she said, waving her hand like she was shooing away an imaginary fly. "It's time to move on." That's when I couldn't hold back any longer. The fact that she didn't have an ounce of regret just set me off. I told her straight up that what she did was unforgivable. She looked at me and said it was her house too now, and she was the wife, so if we didn't like it, we could leave. She even had the nerve to say we should be grateful she removed all those reminders of death so we could finally heal. Heal? Right, because nothing says healing like unsolicited arson. My dad cut her off, cool as ice, and said, "I pay the mortgage. My name is on the documents. You're the one who's leaving." This was the last straw for my dad, not to mention the fact that she didn't even bother to visit him while he was in the hospital. But when he finally told her to leave, she refused, and things got pretty heated. My dad started looking pale again, so I guided him over to the couch, practically shoving him down and telling her to back off. She looked unfazed, like she hadn't just been driving a man to the edge of another hospital trip. Once he'd calmed down and his breathing was stable, I helped him to bed. The next morning, the house was filled with this tense, uncomfortable silence. I tiptoed downstairs, half expecting her to have packed her bags and left. But no, there she was, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand like she'd just returned from a yoga retreat. She didn't even glance up when I walked in, just sat there glued to her phone, typing away like she was drafting her next novel. I poured myself some coffee, but just as I took a sip, the phone calls started. First, it was my aunt, asking what on earth was going on and why my stepmother had called her in the middle of the night, crying about how we were ganging up on her. and making her feel like an outsider. I tried to set the record straight, but quickly realized that my stepmother had already sold her own Twilight Zone version of events. Then came a call from my dad's best friend, who was worried after hearing that my dad was apparently losing it and lashing out at my stepmom due to grief. She made it sound like we were the ones who had crossed a line. And as I pieced together this web of alternative facts, I glanced over to see her at the kitchen table, still smirking as she tapped away on her phone, no doubt spreading her next update. That was it. I couldn't stand it anymore. I slammed my mug down on the counter so hard it echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Her fingers froze mid-type, and for the first time, she looked up. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I shouted at her, feeling my blood practically boiling. She finally looked up from her phone, completely unbothered, and said she was making sure people knew the truth. According to her, my dad and I clearly weren't in the right state of mind to handle things, so she had graciously taken it upon herself to set the record straight. I couldn't help but laugh, because she was dead serious. I told her she was spreading lies to everyone and acting like she was the victim. She rolled her eyes and went on a whole rant about how she'd never been welcomed and was treated like a placeholder ever since my mom passed away, as if the family had made her some sad understudy in a play she never signed up for. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "This is my dad's house, and you're bitter because you know you'll never measure up to the woman my mom was." I told her she needed to get out immediately, or I'd be calling the police. She stood up slowly, her eyes locked on mine, and with a chilling calm said, "We'll see about that." Then she brushed past me, leaving me standing there as the door closed behind her. I knew right then and there, this was far from over. She was going to fight dirty, and if we didn't find a way to stop her, she was going to try to take everything from us. It was like something out of a courtroom drama. Except, unfortunately for us, this villain wasn't fictional. After all the calls from family and friends, my dad's stress levels went through the roof. His health took a serious nosedive. He wasn't sleeping, and the strain was taking a toll on his heart. The doctors warned us that he couldn't handle much more, and that if something didn't change, it might be the end. Watching her destroy him bit by bit was unbearable. We knew we had to get her out of our lives, but she clearly wasn't planning on a quiet exit. That's when it hit me. We needed some legal backup.